So, Charlie, just as we are sitting down to record this episode, the Ukrainian Telegram is going wild. I have some breaking news for you. I'll read the headline directly. This is coming from David Axe, who works for Forbes. Quote, Russia may have launched a second Oreshnik ballistic missile at Ukraine, but this one reportedly exploded on Russian soil. Gets better. For more tea, you can go directly to Forbes on this one, but to quote, here's another great paragraph. 3 months later, on Thursday morning, as in after the initial launch, the Russians reportedly launched another Oreshnik, this one apparently targeting Kiev. Air raid sirens wailed, city residents scrambled for shelter, but then nothing. No scream of incoming re-entry vehicles, no thunderous impacts as the non-explosive vehicles slammed into the ground. This happened in Dnipro before. Bro, if I was an engineer, if
you were an engineer, you would be worried right now.
No, if I was an engineer, this kind of missile I would make, bro. You know, I mean, you recall that there was like a video of a missile that, again, the military bros can correct me.
Yes,
but
which went back on itself.
You know the famous video, right, where the missile gets launched and then it just shoots itself. Oh, that's great.
What I'm looking forward to finding out is whether the Americans were warned about this in advance, because last time Russia launched an Oreshnik, Moscow got in touch to say, by the way, this medium-range ballistic missile we're firing that can fly at 10 times the speed of sound will set off all of your automatic warning systems because it looks an awful lot like a nuke. But please don't think it's a nuke. We don't want a situation where we're reliant on a Stanislav Petrov type to avert nuclear war.
And sadly, we don't know if there's a Stanislav Petrov. But I gotta say, I think Ukrainians at this point are, prepared for a potential nuclear launch. At least some people
more than most, probably.
More than most. But the Ukrainian Telegram has already churned out like all the relevant memes. Повітряний простір України, like one of the bigger Telegram channels that kind of informs the public about the movement of missiles and drones, straight up posted a monkey Putin meme, which for the visuals, our viewers are more than welcome to Google it already. And on that note, let's start.
Welcome to All Out on the Eastern Front, a new podcast where we talk about the most important stories from Eastern Europe and Eurasia each week. I'm Charlie Hancock, a journalist at the Moscow Times and writer about European security at Crisis Europa.
And my name is Kat Shengelia. I'm an MA student at King's College London and a wannabe journalist. This week, Dalibor Rohac from the... Oh, wow, look at the... I went on this. Damn. Dalibor Rohac from the American Enterprise Institute joined us to talk about yet another line of protests, this time taking place in Slovakia. But don't worry, we have many more news that are hot and ready, straight out of the oven for you, and that's next. Charlie, I will let you take the lead.
Indeed. Well, the cheese is still bubbling at the top of this khachapuri, and we are going to start in Poland, which, if you've been following European political trends over the past 5 years or so, you will know that Poland has been on quite a journey. Along with Hungary, it was one of the EU members that saw serious erosions in democratic standards in the late 2010s. Notably, Poland came under fire in 2018 after the establishment of a new body within the Supreme Court that had the power to discipline judges. But most of the judges in this disciplinary chamber were appointed by a national council that was appointed by appointees of the right-wing populist Law and Justice Party. So you can see immediately how people started to worry that this could be used to target judges who were unfavourable towards the regime.
So for the crayon-eating ladies like me, could you give an example?
Yeah, so in 2020, the chamber accused Judge Igor Tuleya, I apologise to our Polish listeners, who was a critic of this body, of overstepping his authority when he allowed media access into a politically sensitive court hearing concerning investigations into the 2017 budget vote. Now, this was seen as potentially something that could expose government misconduct. And in 2020, the chamber stripped him of his judicial immunity, meaning that he could be prosecuted in a criminal court.
And what's going to happen now?
So the European Court of Justice ordered Poland to dismantle this disciplinary chamber, but Warsaw refused, so the ECJ imposed a fine of €1 million every day until
my God.
until the chamber was dismantled fully. And it really added up. The court didn't think that had been done satisfactorily until 2023, so the fine came to a record-breaking €320 million. If you're wondering how the maths holds up, the daily fine was halved in 2022 because Warsaw had made a lot of steps in the right direction. Now, that is an awful lot of money, and at the same time, the European Union was withholding some funds from the reconstruction funds after COVID in order to try and encourage Poland and Hungary to take more progressive reforms. Poland has asked the court for a refund, arguing that the fine kept on growing even as Poland was making serious efforts to comply with the order and dismantle the chamber. That request... What you've just heard there is a air attack alert over Kiev, I assume.
I think we're not even
phone.
gonna. Yeah, I think we're not even gonna crop this out in the editing later. But yeah, I apologize to the audience listening. I'll mute my phone. But
no, I think we should definitely leave that in. It's the reality of what your family is going through.
That's my dad specifically. Yeah, but so go on. So okay, so they're making all of these reforms. They're trying supposedly, to fix all of this, but isn't Poland facing a conundrum, right? Because the presidency is still held by the Law and Justice Party, but they don't have a parliamentary majority, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I brought this up right now. So the latest development in the story is that the court has rejected Poland's request to have the remainder of this fine lifted. So they're going to have to pay the full amount. And this matters because, as you said, the president of Poland is still a member of the Law and Justice Party. But that could change this summer when the Poles go to the polls in what could be one of the most important elections in 2025. Sorry, just that Poles go to the polls. And that is because the current president, Andrzej Duda, is not only very critical of the liberal Europhile Prime Minister Donald Tusk, but has even vetoed legislation that he has put forward. Currently, Tusk's ally is polling in the lead, but it's a close race with months to go. And Poland has quickly become one of the most important countries in Europe, both as a growing economy, but also as an important defence and security partner in the brick of the wall that is Europe's response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
This is kind of a thing that obviously we may delve deeper into as time goes on, but I think it still shouldn't be denied that Poland really is on the rise, to the point where even some of my friends who are foreigners working in Germany in the IT sector are now considering Poland as a serious place to move to. So it goes to show that when Eastern Europe tries hard, it really does achieve incredible things.
Definitely. And one of the reasons why in the UK we're currently, I say we like I still live there, I live in the Netherlands currently, why we're facing a shortage in tradesmen is because the UK is not a very attractive prospect for lots of Eastern European workers right now. When Poland's economy is on the up and it's actually starting to get its own cultural exports, like through the Witcher franchise, why would you leave when wages are rising in your country, whereas in the UK they've been stagnant for over the past decade? Well, since the 2008 financial crisis.
Well, maybe if I was a UK parliamentarian getting paid, I would be able to better answer your question. But currently, I'm unemployed. If anyone from a UK-based news agency is listening to this, I am available.
Now, hire Katja. She can do many things in many languages.
In many languages, especially ranting and cursing. So thank you for that, Charlie. Let's move on to the Caucasus region. Georgia, of course, will be mentioned. You know that I have to.
Maybe we need to have a special jingle for whenever Georgia gets mentioned.
Oh,
the Georgia jingle.
Get some
panduri plucking going on.
Get it, and duduki as well, and the noise of parliamentarians fighting. So let's move to the Caucasus, but we're not going to start from Georgia right away. We're actually going to begin from Azerbaijan. So let's touch upon the ongoing developments with the crash of Azerbaijan Airlines aircraft near Aktau.
In Kazakhstan, not in Azerbaijan.
Exactly. So as a reminder, on December 25th last year, Embraer 190, it suffered what is believed to be a Panzer S missile strike while flying over Russia en route to Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, from Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan. Now, the reason I'm saying that this is alleged is because we've only now started getting first tidbits of a preliminary investigation by the Kazakh kind of equivalent of the NTSB, kind of their own National Transportation Safety Board. And of course, it's a tragedy in which only 29 of the aircraft's 62 souls survived. By souls, I mean passengers and crew alike. So on February 5th, yesterday, from the time of this recording, the Kazakh aviation authorities, they finally released a preliminary report on this crash after an initial delay last month in January. The report confirms what many aviation experts, unless they're paid by Kremlin, have already been predicting, which is the report confirms that the GPS system was not functioning and that the aircraft was subjected to 2 instances of external impact. It verifies that the fuselage, including the hydraulic systems, suffered severe damage from an unidentified striking element, from unidentified striking elements, because there were 2, leading to a failure of the control systems. What is important here is that from the very beginning, the Kremlin tried its best to shift any blame it could, with Putin sort of, apologizing to the Azeri president, but stopping short of saying Russia was responsible. And this seems to have done little to please Aliyev, who, unlike perhaps some of Russia's neighbors, is not oriented toward Moscow, but toward Ankara. When we think about, for example, Armenia kind of being uncertain about whether it wants to be with Russia or without it, viewing Russia as its protector, Azerbaijan has always been a bit more pragmatic. But if there is one thing that energy independence and protection from Turkey has granted Azerbaijan is the fact that it can turn back around toward Moscow and make demands. So, according to Azem Media, which cites Ilham Aliyev's interview from December 29th, the primary motivator for this lawsuit has to do with the perception of Baku that Russia is unwilling to take the investigation seriously and functions basically in a permanent state of denial. So, if you recall, Rosaviatse, the country's Russia's aviation authority, it repeatedly blamed the crash on bird strikes and explosion of gas and oxygen canisters, demons, angels, whatever it is. And Kremlin was basically unwilling to make amends toward Baku that Aliyev would have found satisfactory. I want to quote him because I find it quite interesting what he said on that December 29th speech. Quote, "From day one, Azerbaijan insisted that this case should be handled by a group of international experts. The Russian side officially proposed that the investigation be conducted by Interstate Aviation Committee." That's the first part, right? And here's the part of the quote that is crazy. So, Charlie, you know that it is no secret that quite a lot of international, quote-unquote, bodies that are created by Russia, they're still staffed by people who are on Kremlin's payroll, right?
Indeed.
So, this is the second part of the quote. I screamed when I read it. To continue, quote, "It is no secret that this structure consists mostly of Russian officials and it is headed by Russian citizens. The objectivity of such an investigation could not be fully ensured. If we had seen fair and adequate steps from Russia immediately after the disaster, we might not have objected, but we saw obvious attempts to cover up the case." What do you think?
That is brazen and very forthright.
And he still hasn't fallen out of a window, which should be a sign. So it goes to show that kind of simultaneously a lot of things are going very wrong for Putin. And I think that it is very correct that, as a couple of news organizations pointed out, that we have yet another MH17. And God knows, with the people who are manning Russia's air defense systems or other forms of dangerous flying metallic objects, who knows if there could be more. I'm going to switch very quickly to Georgia. I know the audience is eager to hear Dalibor speak, but I'm going to skim over kind of one of the stories of kind of continued repressions in Georgia, which is amendments that are currently being introduced that... So, you know what hooliganism is, right? Like, hooliganism is when...
of course, running around, being violent, thinking of football hooligans.
Oh, like football, right? It gets better, though. So now, hooliganism is going to be expanded in Georgia. It's going to include public criticism of officials. And verbal insults against government figures could now result in fines of more than $2,000 or 60 days in prison. There's also
that would be, if you were to expand that to the United Kingdom, that would be a fantastic means of levying new income for the Treasury.
I think that the whole population of the UK would be just jailed, because if you ever open any comment, literally
a national swear jar, essentially.
A national swear jar, yeah, basically. But further kind of reinforcing government officials as the status of government officials as an untouchable class, threats directed at political office holders, state officials, or their family members would carry a prison sentence of up to 3 years, increasing to 6 in aggravated cases. Now, look, in most normal countries, making threats is already illegal. However, this change, it grants officials stronger legal protections than ordinary citizens. Right? It further underscores that the repressive nature of the legislation. And naturally, we should expect the definition of a threat to be as vague as possible to kind of maintain the atmosphere of fear among the public. But again, it was to be expected. Meanwhile, as the government cracks down on its own citizens, there seems to be far less focus on Georgia turning into a hub for drug and human trafficking.
Historically, one of the branches of the Silk Road passed through Georgia. It has been the center of many trade routes going in different directions. Of course, you would expect, grimly, you would expect it to be a place where there was a lot of human trafficking.
Well, unfortunately, the story that is taking place right now is not taking place in the 12th century, but in the 21st. And, you know, initially, when I sent this story to Charlie, she thought I was talking about a literal egg and chicken farm.
Because the internet right now is obsessed with the price of eggs in the United States and bird flu.
Exactly. But when she opened the link of the story I sent her, she realized that, oh no, we're talking about part of a human body. So in a harrowing revelation, approximately 100 Thai women have fallen victim to a human trafficking scheme in Georgia, orchestrated by Chinese criminal syndicate. This was reported by Pavena Foundation for Children and Women based out of Thailand.
This is absolutely sickening.
No, right? Because you have a government that is talking about foreign influence and foreign agents and all of this benign criminal gangs, and you have all of this going on under their noses. So the victims were, according to the statements of some of the women who managed to escape, the victims were lured by promises of lucrative surrogacy opportunities abroad.
And the surrogacy industry in Georgia is huge. It is one of
huge.
It is one of the most popular destinations for couples who are looking to hire a woman, a foreign uterus, essentially, to carry their pregnancy.
Which just goes to show that, you know, usually people who are doing well in an economy don't choose surrogacy as their primary career.
No, remember at the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine when
there were couples who paid Ukrainian women, if my memory serves me right, to be their surrogate parent and then abandoned them, right?
Yeah. There were unclaimed children. It was, horrible story.
So, you know, East European lives costing less. What's new?
And Thai lives costing less as well.
Yeah. So the victims, they were lured by advertisements that promised between $12,000 to $17,000. Upon arrival, their passports were confiscated and they were transported to a compound, 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 with 4 houses. There, they were informed that instead of surrogacy, they would be forced to undergo monthly egg revival procedures.
And as anybody who knows anybody who has gone through IVF or has donated their eggs, whether it be whether it be just as a donation or whether it be for money, which some women our age do. That's what this economy is like. It's a harrowing thing to do to your body, having to inject all the hormones to increase egg production. Then you have to have an operation to harvest the eggs that have been produced, which are far more than your body should be producing.
No, exactly. So one victim who came forward, she basically stated that they were held like cattle in this compound, and there were up to 60 women with her in just one building. These extracted eggs were likely sent abroad for use in IVF, and the victims were, just like you said, subjected to hormone treatments and invasive medical procedures with their eggs retrieved every month. With a story like this, one would expect the Georgian government to be on high alert, right? You know, traditional Christian country and etc. And as a Christian myself, I find, valuing women's lives especially so incredibly important.
That's just being a decent human being, valuing women's lives. I know that's quite hard these days, but
no,
it's
yeah,
a rare
of course.
thing.
But if you remember, Georgia holds the church and subsequently the Christian faith in a very special status, right? And there's a reason that the Virgin Mary is such an important figure. With a story like this, one would expect the Georgian government to be on high alert. However, priorities clearly lie elsewhere. In a related development, Georgia's public defender, Levan Yoseniani, has faced criticism for allegedly disclosing confidential information about the location of a crisis center during a television interview. Lacking any sense of responsibilities and kind of desperate to dismiss the opposition as usual, he basically brushed off the backlash, labeling it as artificial. And all of this is happening as the U.S. Department of State publishes a report stating that Georgia remains a, quote, critical hub in the global drug trade, unquote. What makes all of this particularly alarming beyond the sheer human suffering and the mistreatment of women is that this is not just any country. This is an EU candidate nation or an EU wannabe candidate nation, once touted as a shining example of modernization and reform. And if there ever was a case study on the dangers of backsliding into Soviet-style governance, both, operationally and sort of culturally, Georgia is it.
I just say, I'm really surprised the story hasn't garnered more wide coverage.
It just broke out as of us recording this a couple hours earlier. There's all of these things going on. I decided to check the British Parliament website, and I saw that it's going to be on the 13th of February. It will be a month since a Lib Dem politician, forgive me, his name escapes me, introduced a bill trying to sanction Bidzina Ivanishvili, Georgia's chief oligarch, virtually the country's owner, Akhak Aladze, the mayor, the prime minister. All of these, forgive me, mafiosi figures are still not sanctioned, while the government propaganda mouthpiece, Imedi, continues to partially operate via a company based in the UK.
That member of parliament is James McCleary, to clarify.
James McCleary. So we love James McCleary on this podcast. If Pookie James McCleary ever wants to come on here and say hi, we will gladly have him. Now, enough of my yapping about depressing news out of Georgia. As promised, this week we spoke with Dalibor Rohac, a wonderful friend of our podcast, and I didn't actually realize until Charlie pointed out that his previous podcast that he hosted was called The Eastern Front and has a similar name to ours. I realized that
but the thing is, we go all out. That is the difference.
We go all out. But anyway, Charlie and Dalibor sat down together to discuss the anti-government protests that have been taking place in Slovakia in recent weeks. So here is their talk right now.
Thank you for joining us, Dalibor. Recent weeks have seen large-scale protests take place across Slovakia, with over 60,000 people taking to the streets of Bratislava on January 24th. What were these protests over?
Ultimately, the protests were over the discontent of Slovaks with the government. that discontent can be traced back to the failure of Robert Fico and his governing coalition to deliver better public services, economic growth, and European levels of prosperity. In terms of per capita GDP, Slovakia was recently overtaken by Romania, of all places. And the protests were also over this question of where Slovakia belongs geopolitically speaking. So Robert Fico, who has been in politics for a long time, he served as prime minister for give or take 12 years over the past 2 decades, has been making more and more explicit overtures to Moscow lately, and that really did not land well with particularly younger people who take for granted that Slovakia is part of the EU and NATO.
So are young people most of the protesters here? The majority of the protesters took to the streets in Bratislava. Is this discontent society-wide? And are there different motivations among the protesters?
Obviously, Slovakia has not been immune to the same sort of culture wars and polarization that you see in other societies. So it will be hard to claim that this is society-wide movement and that Fico is hanging by a thread. However, when you look at opinion polling, it is true that the support for the coalition that he is leading has declined. If there were an early election, it is unlikely that he would be able to cobble together the same or similar sort of governing coalition that he is leading today. And the protests were not limited to the capital city. You had over 120,000 people, I believe, that came to the streets at the largest of those protests week or so ago on Friday evening in Bratislava and other cities. And that, I imagine, rattled the Prime Minister and made him come up with these really grotesque conspiracy theories about supposed Western interference into Slovak politics and supposed interference by the Ukrainians and by the Georgian opposition of all people. So really he's sort of kind of doubled down on the path he is on, and it looks like for now that he might weather the storm for now, but again the coalition he's leading is somewhat fragile, so we'll have to wait and see.
I was just about to ask you about Fico's response to these protests. What kind of conspiracy theories has he been bringing up?
Well, before I get to that, maybe it's worth giving a little bit of background on Fico himself. Fico is a very effective political operator. He understood, I think, very early on where the grievances of a large number of Slovaks were coming from, and he was able to seize them and capitalize on them. He's been very ideologically flexible, although he does have, I suppose, a sort of ideological intellectual core to himself, which would be a sense of Soviet nostalgia and a suspicion of the West more generally. Initially, the party that he started in 1999 was modeled a little bit after the third way of social democracy of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, tried to kind of chart a pragmatic third way between the left and the right as it opposed pro-market reforms in Slovakia, but it took on a more and more of illiberal and reactionary streak over time, combining anti-immigrant rhetoric and leaning more heavily into kind of pro-Russian sentiments that had always existed in Slovakia.
Are those pro-Russian sentiments in Slovakia present in Czechia? Because, of course, the two countries, they separated from Czechoslovakia in 1992, and Czechia has a much more pro-Western government right now. It is a much more proactive member of the European Union and NATO. How have the two paths that the countries have taken since the dissolution changed? And are there any longer-term factors before the dissolution that have contributed to that split?
So, I mean, I don't want to take us too deep down a rabbit hole, but it is worth stressing that the Czechs and Slovaks have somewhat different historic experiences, both in the 20th century and also in the 19th century, in the era of romantic nationalism. The Slovak version was, I suppose, much more heavily centered on the idea of kind of solidarity of Slavic tribes and their togetherness, and some Slovak writers would sort of see Russia as the central element of that community. The experience of 1968 and the Soviet invasion is something that one would think kind of reset people's thinking about Soviet Union and Russia. But again, the experience of the Czech part of what was then Czechoslovakia and the Slovak part were different. 1968 was the year of a federalization of sort of then communist Czechoslovakia, which afforded much greater opportunities for upward mobility for ambitious young apparatchiks such as Robert Fico, who really saw the 1970s, 1980s as an era of increasing prosperity and new opportunities, whereas I think the almost uniform experience of the Czechs of that period was one of dreariness and repression. And therefore, I think the formative experiences of the sort of political elites of those two countries are somewhat different. It's very difficult to, I think, unhelpful to overgeneralize though. So the Czech debate on Russia and on the war in Ukraine is somewhat nuanced. The country is headed into an election later this year, and it is widely expected that election will be won by Andrej Babiš, who, besides being ethnically Slovak and speaking in a somewhat broken Czech, is also somebody who has been basically parroting the same sort of talking points that you hear from Fico and Viktor Orban about the conflict.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier that Fico has responded to the protests by coming out with lots of conspiracy theories. Let's go into more detail about those. You referenced Ukraine and Georgia. What's he saying? What is he saying is going on?
He's basically trying to blame the protests on outside interference coming from the West. Nebulous kind of conspiracy of Soros, the Ukrainian government, Georgian Legion fighting in Ukraine. So for some reason, Mamuka Mamulashvili has made an appearance in these sort of fantasies of Mr. Fico. And one
we
has
should
to wonder
probably
whether...
explain who that is and what the Georgian Legion is, because it isn't quite what its name suggests.
So Mamuka Mamulashvili is the commander of a group fighting in Ukraine, which consists of mostly Georgian volunteers fighting under Ukrainian command. This gentleman was interviewed by a Slovak journalist some years ago at the beginning of the war and visited Bratislava, took part in a panel discussion during the launch of the book, and pictures taken at that opportunity has served basically the starting point of this conspiracy that has been peddled by Fico in recent weeks. Supposedly he was in Slovakia to kind of instigate the downfall of the Slovak government. The fact that it's a gentleman of size and he was wearing military fatigues was enough in and by itself to make it credible in the eyes of, I suppose, Fico's electoral base. So I mean, it's completely ludicrous, but it's part of a broader pattern with Fico, which is one of really fantasizing about the West and the United States in particular, kind of trying to instigate his demise. He was already ousted in 2018 after a wave of public protests, which he described as a color revolution, as a Maidan. Again, he's basically having recourse to the same playbook. Now, although this time around it looks like he will be able to actually hold his governing coalition together for at least months to come. But I think it is safe to say that Mamuka Mamulashvili or his colleagues are not and have not been involved in any sort of political shenanigans in Slovakia, trying to overthrow the government or organizing protests. After this big public protest 10 days ago, Fico claimed that 1/3 of those protesting were Ukrainians, which was absolutely a ridiculous claim, because obviously there probably aren't that many of them living in Slovakia anyway.
And where is the opposition in this?
Well, the opposition has been trying to counter this rhetoric by trying to bring the conversation back to bread and butter issues, if you will. I mean, the thing about these protests is that they have been organized by groups that are not necessarily political. These are people who, I mean, do care about Ukraine and want to kind of express their support to Ukraine, notwithstanding the official position of the Slovak government, which has been much colder towards Ukrainians. And the political opposition, the parties that are represented in parliament, they sort of took part in the protests, but they are not kind of actively driving them. And I think it is a testament to Fico's political skills in a way that he's been able to kind of drive the conversation and set his own themes, and that you don't really see opposition leaders doing the same in a particularly effective way. So these kind of attempts to bring the debate back to questions of rising living costs, etc., are not really resonating quite as much as the way kind of Fico's framing of the debate.
Mm-hmm. Why have living costs got to such a bad condition right now that people are taking to the streets?
Well, obviously, energy prices are a big part of the challenge as elsewhere in Europe. German economy, of which Slovakia is in a way an extension of, is headed into a recession, if it's not already in a recession. And Slovakia is one of those countries that was quite successful in the early stages of the post-communist transition, particularly in the noughties when the country joined the European Union, opened up, attracted lots of foreign investment in the auto industry in particular. But there hasn't been a concerted effort to bring the economy to the next level by investing in human capital, by investing in kind of institutions that could sort of support startups and sort of higher value-added businesses in services and in the industry. And I think this has been sort of catching up with the Slovaks. PISA results, the survey of high school graduates, I mean, Slovakia is trailing the list of EU and OECD countries on some of these metrics, and is becoming an increasingly sort of backwater and a poor country that has seen massive outflow of kind of human talent and especially young people to neighboring countries and to the UK and elsewhere.
One recent event that has hit Slovakia is the expiration of a deal which allowed Russian gas to flow through Ukraine towards Slovakia. Is that one of the motivations behind the protests going on right now? The impacts of that?
So I'm not sure it's a motivation behind the protest per se. It's been one of the themes that Fico has seized and tried to run with. And that was nominally the reason for his trip to Moscow just before Christmas last year, where he supposedly tried to negotiate some other deal with the Russians, tried to kind of provide for supply of energy. I don't know, like through what route, but that's what he said he was doing. I mean, the thing is that it was very clear, it was very transparent that Ukrainians would not be renewing the transit agreement. So they were signaling this very clearly. You had the previous Slovak government that's been trying to sign some contracts, fill up Slovak reserves of natural gas, look for natural gas elsewhere. If anything, this exercise would have been much easier in the context of 2024. I mean, the gas market is much more interconnected, integrated. There's LNG coming, etc., etc. But Fico deliberately, just like the Hungarians, decided not to do this and to rely solely on supply of gas from Russia.
Why?
And I think the calculation was, I mean, it's probably marginally cheaper, and the calculation was that he would be able then to blame the resulting crisis on the Ukrainians, and that's what he's doing now. There is a segment of the electorate that does find it convincing. I do think that Fico, in a way, is harboring a certain hatred of Zelensky and of the Ukrainians, which I'm not sure how rational it is, but it is real, and it's sort of driving some of his behavior, regardless of whether it is kind of politically sensible or not. But
where do you think that hatred is coming from?
Slovaks for a long time have looked down to Ukraine as a country that is backwards and ridden with criminal gangs. There was zero curiosity in Slovakia about life in Ukraine. You would hardly ever meet anybody who would visit Ukraine, and so from the perspective of kind of post-communist elite in Slovakia, particularly those who had this affinity towards the Soviet era, I think you would very often kind of see a very dismissive attitude towards Ukraine, seeing it just as a vehicle for gas transit in a way, and not as a as a nation that would kind of have its own culture, its own nationhood, etc. So Fico was one of the early critics of the EU sanctions regime adopted in the wake of the annexation of Crimea and the initial attack against eastern Ukraine in 2014. He would never go quite as far as Viktor Orban in trying to derail these initiatives, but he would always bitterly complain, and he would always seek to reach out to Moscow and present himself as a friend of the Kremlin, and now he has kind of doubled down on that and really behaved in an increasingly unhinged manner. And some of it actually might have to do with the fact that he survived an assassination attempt earlier in 2024. He was visiting a smallish town where his cabinet had a kind of remote cabinet meeting. He was saying hello to the local crowd that assembled, and a man in his 70s, probably not mentally stable, shot him several times, and he was out of public eye for several weeks. Apparently came close to dying, but he pulled through, and I think he returned back to the office more ruthless and kind of hardened. And I think one manifestation of that has been that he really, like Viktor Orban, has made this bet that Eastern Europe is headed into a new era in which NATO and the EU will not be playing the same role as they did before. That this is a sort of post-American world that Eastern Europeans will be living in, and I suppose similarly to Viktor Orban, Fico fancies himself as a sort of deal maker who will be sitting at a table in the Kremlin making deals for his country. And obviously that's a complete delusion. But there has been also outreach to China that's been going on under his watch. Perhaps in the short run, he might in a way be vindicated, given the ongoing developments in Washington, that indeed Eastern Europe might be headed into a more or less post-American era.
One thing that's really struck me from our conversation compared to so much of the coverage of these protests is how lots of mainstream coverage has focused on the gas issue, and that people's reaction against Fico's overtures towards Russia, whereas you're focusing so much more on other socioeconomic issues affecting Slovakia.
Well, so the gas issue is, that's the conversation that Fico is trying to have. So he says, we've had this relationship with Russia for decades. They supplied us with cheap energy. We want to continue in that, and now it's being disrupted by these nefarious forces led by Vladimir Zelensky and the Americans, who want to sell us expensive LNG instead. And so he is trying to portray himself as the sort of hero fighting for Slovak interests. And that lands with some segment of the electorate, but I think people who have taken it to the streets can see through it, and they understand that cheap Russian energy does have a geopolitical price tag. They also understand that Fico is not this sort of heroic anti-establishment figure, but that he's somebody who has been actually running the country for the better part of the past 2 decades, and that he has very little to show for his years in power. That there has been very little progress that Slovakia has seen while he was while he's been in power and governing and setting the policy agenda.
Mm-hmm. Let's take this conversation towards the future more so. So you didn't give the most optimistic assessment of the opposition's power and the opposition's prospect. How concrete are the demands that these protesters have been making? Is there any potential blueprint for further steps into Slovakia's future that they're presenting?
Well, that's an interesting question. So the protests themselves are, I think, aimed at putting pressure at the government to kind of recommit in a credible fashion to Slovakia's place in the Western community of democracies, in the EU and NATO. I think many people in Slovakia were particularly disturbed by the noises coming from Mr. Fico's party about the possibility of Slovakia's exiting the EU if it became necessary. I mean, they kind of backtrack on that a little bit, but it was the first time that you would hear anything like that in the Slovak Slovak debate. I mean, the population is committed to EU membership in a way some of Slovakia's neighbors might not be. So that was one of the driving forces, and the other one is the realization that Fico's governing majority is slim, right? He in a 150-seat legislature has started with a majority of perhaps 3 seats, and some of these MPs who came to the parliament on various party lists have kind of started to play a more of an independent role, and they have to be negotiated with, bargained with, and bribed individually, which kind of increases the transaction costs for Fico of holding the coalition together. And a few weeks ago, the coalition actually came close to disintegrating. So we had 3 or 4 MPs who kind of took an independent stand, and it was very difficult to even get parliament in session. But it looks like Fico has been able to work out some sort of arrangement with these kind of independent-minded parliamentarians.
What were they objecting to?
Well, so some of them, there are 2 groups of people who are sort of causing a headache to Fico. One is a sort of faction within the list of the Slovak National Party, which ran a list of kind of motley crew of nationalist conspiracy theorists, people who are into hunting, and so they got into parliament, and so they have the sense that they sort of deserve a bigger role and a seat at the table while governing. That's one source of friction. The other source of friction is within another party called Hlas, or Voice in English, which is kind of the more sort of civilized pro-Western phase of the governing coalitions. There were 3 or 4 members of the party in parliament who were actually rattled by this outreach to Moscow and the trips made by the prime minister and by a number of other officials to Russia, and they kind of emerged as conscientious objectors, but they were promptly brought back in line by kind of pork barrel spending directed at their local. I mean, one of them is a mayor of a small town, and the government promptly went to spend lots of money to rebuild bridges and restore old buildings and do those sorts of things. So that kind of brought the person back in line. And I imagine that similar kind of arrangements were made with other rebels, if you will.
It looks like this isn't going to be sorted out anytime soon. And with Fico having accepted an invitation to attend the Victory Day parades on May the 9th in Moscow, then this could very easily be whipped back up all over again.
I think that's right. And again, he must realize that his governing majority is slim. There'll be events, particularly on the financial markets, I imagine, that will make it difficult for him to govern in a kind of unhinged populist fashion. So it might be in his interest eventually to call an early election, but I think he very much wants to be the one who will kind of determine the timing so that it plays to his strengths. And again, we'll have to wait and see when that is. But I think the odds of him sort of surviving his full term are not particularly strong.
Interesting. Well, Dalibor, thank you very much for coming on All Out on the Eastern Front. We'd love to have you back.
Thank you. Anytime. Thank you.
So that was Charlie and Dalibor. Now, Charlie, after all of the yapping, I will hand the mic back to you. You have some news coming out of Moldova. Ooh.
Yes, I thought we should keep things going about how different European countries have been affected by the end of gas transit through Ukraine. So Moldova has just agreed a 2-year strategy with the EU to develop its energy independence. Moldova, like Georgia, is aspiring to EU membership, although it hasn't backslided in the same way.
We stand an independent queen. We slay, Moldova, slay.
I once had a dream where I was going into a pharmacy and the pharmacist was Maya Sandu.
Maya Sandu, if you're hearing this, we want you to girl boss on this podcast as well.
Maya, we would love to talk to you, by the way. We would love that.
We would love to. We would love to. Just 3 queens in a podcast. That's it.
It didn't even look like Maya Sandu. I just looked at the woman behind the counter and my brain said, that is Maya Sandu.
Who knows? Maybe in an alternative universe that really did happen. So, energy independence and no backsliding.
Yes. So, Chisinau is going to receive 250 million euros to compensate residents and businesses for the skyrocketing energy costs that have hit the region, as well as to support its integration into broader European energy infrastructure and also plans to develop domestic sustainable energy. It's actually been a very busy week for energy in Eastern Europe because this week the Baltic states disconnected from the Russian grid. But let's stick in around Moldova because, interestingly, further 60 million euros have been earmarked for Transnistria, a slither of land along the border with Ukraine that is essentially run as a Russian puppet state, complete with 1,500 Russian ground troops stationed there. By the end of the year, when this deal expired, Moldova had started to diversify its energy supply away from Russia, notably via Romania. But Transnistria hadn't. The region has been in a state of emergency even before the gas shut off and had to switch to burning coal instead. But that still has not been enough to meet domestic energy needs, affecting not just people's homes, but also schools and hospitals. Transnistrian authorities are yet to comment on this latest deal at time of recording, but the agreement does come with some conditions. Notably that Tiraspol, the capital of the region, will discuss with Chisinau ways to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms in the region. A region which, if you look at any global ranking for human rights, is right down there at the bottom with several other former Soviet republics in Central Asia, partially recognized former Soviet regions in Eurasia, and several other dictatorships. Another condition of this deal is that energy prices will be gradually brought up to market rates for household consumers, and that businesses that are very energy intensive or even export energy, which Transnistria actually exported energy to the rest of Moldova, they will have to pay for energy at market rates too and will be excluded from the support program. This is significant because Transnistria's energy supplies from Russia were heavily subsidized to the extent that Transnistrians would only pay about 6 cents per cubic meter of gas, whereas those in the rest of Moldova, wait for this, Kat, the consumers in the rest of Moldova were charged around a full $1 for the same amount.
Okay, I can understand now why when I visited Transnistria, I saw so many United Russia offices all over the place. I mean, it looked depressing as shit, but, 6 cents? Not bad, not bad.
Every cloud, as they say. Well, I think I read somewhere that salt used to be free in Turkmenistan.
I think we need to pack our bags. I think Amsterdam and London are no longer the prime locations.
Trade in all of our human rights and go to Turkmenistan. That's it for this week's episode of All Out on the Eastern Front. Sadly, I'm not going to be here next time.
Aww.
Because I'll be busy at the Munich Security Conference.
Oh.
Yes, I'm going along there as a journalist for my day job at the Moscow Times. I'm really looking forward to talking to lots of people working on European security against Russia, the war in Ukraine, and what the future of Russia could look like from an international perspective. So if you're going to be there, please get in touch. I would love to talk to you. But if you're not going to be there, or if you will, but you still want to listen in, you can still join Kat and a mystery guest co-host next week at 6 p.m. London time on either Spotify or YouTube.
If you like what we do, the software we use and the food for our cats won't pay for themselves. So a link to our Patreon page will be provided in the show notes. Also, we have now finally launched our Buy Me a Coffee page. So if you wish to support us with a one-time donation, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee.
And your donations will be particularly welcome at this time, because if you've been following my former Bloomberg colleague Javier Blas's comments, you will know that the price of coffee is due to spike again. So unless you want Kat and I to, although I don't drink coffee, so unless you want Kat to...
Ooh, wow.
Unless you want Kat to fritter away her chances of home ownership on, I don't know, on Blank Street Coffee, then please donate.
Yeah, you could choose whether you want to pay the London, New York, Istanbul, Airport, or Tashkent coffee fees. And also, you can get in touch with us by Twitter at Hancock2001 and at Ish, and Helia. If you don't know how to spell either my last name or Charlie's, do not worry, the links to these will also be provided in the show notes below.
You'd be surprised how many people fail to spell Hancock correctly.
Well, there you go. So, on that note, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next week.